Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to the Missing Dogs. Jahan komondia solon kochektehin, jin se logdartein, the questions buried under fear, faith, and forbidden history. Yahan hum Qur'an, science, psychology, or hidden realities, ko aiki table par bitadhain, tearing apart illusions and exposing the truths that society quietly hides. Agar aap wohi sunna chahte hain, jo duniya sunate hai. This is not your place. लेकिन अगर आप वो देखना चाहते हैं जो नजर नहीं आता, वो समझना चाहते हैं जो बताया नहीं जाता, then step in. क्योंकि यहाँ हर डाट connect होता है और हर सच अपना चेहरा दिखाता है.
Alhamdulillah. It really is. It's incredibly peaceful out here today in the courtyard.
Yeah, it really is. Just sitting here after Maghrib, it's perfect. But, if you are sitting here with us right now, just listening in, I want you to imagine how quickly that kind of peace can just completely vanish.
Oh, absolutely. In an instant.
Right. So picture this. It's 3 a.m. The room is pitch black. And you wake up suddenly.
Just wide awake.
Exactly. Your mind is completely alert, but your body is entirely paralyzed.
Yeah.
You can't lift a single finger. You can't even scream. And then right out of the corner of your eye, you see this shadow just standing at the foot of your bed.
Yeah. And, I mean, for centuries, across so many different empires and deserts, we've actually had a very specific name for that exact shadow.
We called it a jinn.
Right. And if you're joining us today, you have definitely heard the stories.
Oh, for sure. Everyone has one.
Exactly. You might even have a story of your own, or like a story from an aunt or a cousin, because the air always feels completely different when we start talking about the unseen.
It really does. Especially right now, sitting out here, the sky is turning that deep, kind of bruised blue color.
The courtyard is emptying out.
Yeah. We're suspended in that weird transition time,
Yeah.
Between daylight and total darkness, which is historically the exact time when people start looking over their shoulders.
It is. It really is.
So I was looking through the notes you brought over earlier, and this isn't just a collection of spooky ghost stories.
No, not at all.
You've brought us this massive cross-disciplinary study that attempts to do something I've honestly rarely seen done with any real intellectual honesty.
It's a rare approach, for sure.
Right. It takes the Qur'an, authentic Hadith, classical tafsir, and then it layers them directly on top of modern neuroscience and clinical psychology, even digital forensics.
Yeah, which is fascinating.
It is. It literally places 7th century theology and 21st century empirical science on the exact same table.
And I have to say, it is a really precarious table to set.
How so?
Well, because the traditional tendency is to approach this from one of two extremes, right?
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have people who look at the unseen world purely through theology. They completely ignore brain chemistry and physics, and they just treat every single psychological symptom as a literal spiritual attack.
Right, like everything is a jinn.
Exactly. Or you swing to the total opposite extreme, the strict secular medical lens, where you just completely dismiss a billion people's faith as primitive superstition, and you mock the very idea of any spiritual reality.
Which is incredibly dismissive.
It is. And the problem is, neither of those approaches actually helps a human being who is genuinely suffering.
And that is exactly our mission today. We're going to look at the exact same human experiences.
The sleep paralysis we just described, for example.
Right. The sleep paralysis, the auditory hallucinations where someone hears a voice whispering commands, the shadow figures caught on those blurry security cameras. We're going to explore how a 1,000-year-old theological framework explains those exact same phenomena alongside modern MRI scans.
And digital camera engineering, which we'll get into later.
Oh, definitely. And we're going to do it without disrespecting faith, but also without turning a blind eye to logic and actual evidence.
But before we start bringing MRI machines and dopamine receptors into the courtyard, we really have to ground ourselves in the language first.
Yeah, that's crucial.
We have to understand what the word jinn actually meant to the people who first heard it in the Qur'an. Because if you ask someone today, they often just equate it to this Western concept of a demon or a ghost.
Right, like something out of a horror movie.
Exactly. And linguistically, that is a massive distortion.
So I was reading about the root system of the Arabic language in preparation for this. And Arabic is just beautifully mathematical.
It really is.
Like almost every word is built on a 3-letter root. And the root for jinn is Jim Nun Nun, J-N-N. And from what I gather, the fundamental meaning of that root has absolutely nothing to do with evil or ghosts.
Nothing at all.
It just means concealment. something that is veiled from your basic senses.
That is the absolute core of it. Anything derived from that root implies hiddenness in some way.
Give me an example.
Well, for instance, the Arabic word for garden or paradise is jannah.
Wait, jhana comes from the same root.
It does, because a true oasis or a garden is so densely packed with lush trees and foliage that the ground is concealed from the sun. It's hidden.
Oh, wow. I never made that connection.
And the word for a fetus in the womb is jan, because, again, it is hidden from the outside world. Even the word for a shield in classical Arabic is mijan, because it conceals the warrior from the enemy's strike.
That is fascinating. And then you have majnun, right?
Yes, exactly.
You use that word so casually today to mean crazy or mad, but classically it meant someone whose intellect or reason had been concealed or covered up.
Precisely. So the word jinn literally just translates to the hidden ones or the concealed entities.
A very neutral term then.
Very neutral. And to really grasp this, I want you and anyone listening right now to put yourself in the shoes of a pre-Islamic Arab.
Okay, setting the scene.
Picture living in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century. There is no electricity, no light pollution. When the sun goes down, the darkness is absolute and total.
I mean, the isolation must have been terrifying. You're just surrounded by this ocean of sand and jagged rocks.
And the sounds, too.
Oh, yeah. The wind howling through those narrow canyons. It can sound remarkably like human voices. I can easily see how pareidolia would kick in.
Pareidolia.
Yeah, it's our brain's natural tendency to find patterns and faces in random noise. In that kind of environment, you'd be running in overdrive.
Absolutely. So for those pre-Islamic Arabs, the jinn were essentially the spirits of that wild nature. They were sort of the arbiters of the wilderness.
So they weren't necessarily these evil demonic forces.
No, they believed these entities inhabited the ruins of old civilizations, deep valleys, remote deserts. And crucially, yeah, they were not viewed as strictly evil. They were just wild.
Like animals almost.
Or like natural disasters. They were unpredictable forces, much like a sudden sandstorm or a flash flood. In fact, many of the greatest poets of the Jahiliyyah, that pre-Islamic era of ignorance, they actually believed that their poetic genius was literally whispered to them by a jinn muse.
They called it a Karen, right? Or a companion, even back then. A spirit that gave them their eloquence.
They did. But then the Qur'an arrives in the 7th century and it completely shatters this folklore.
How so?
It takes these wild, chaotic nature spirits and it domesticates them into a strict monotheistic framework.
I was really fascinated by this shift when reading the notes, because the Qur'an basically strips them of their mythical, godlike status.
Exactly. It demystifies them.
It says to the Arabs, like, no, these are not minor deities you should offer sacrifices to. They are not magical muses. They are just a parallel creation.
Right. They are creations of Allah living alongside you on this earth. And most importantly, this is the key, they are morally accountable.
And that's the revolutionary theological shift, isn't it?
It changes everything. The Qur'an grants them free will. In Surah Al-Jinn, chapter 72, verse 11, the Qur'an actually quotes them speaking directly. They say, among us are the righteous and among us are those contrary to that. So they have a choice.
Which means they have societies.
Yes.
They can be believers, they can be arrogant, they can be ignorant. They make moral choices just like we do, and therefore they face divine judgment.
Exactly. It takes away that spooky campfire story element and replaces it with a very heavy theological reality. They are bound by the exact same ultimate rules of consequence that we are.
And because they have free will, we get a very specific taxonomy in the Islamic tradition. Like, jinn is the broad biological species, so to speak. But then you have subcategories based on their behavior and their power.
Right. You have the Shaytan.
Which is usually translated as devils, but people get really confused here.
They do, especially with the Western influence.
Right, because in Christian theology, Satan is a fallen angel. But in Islam, angels do not have free will. They physically cannot disobey. So Iblis, the devil, could never have been an angel.
That is a critical distinction to make. The Qur'an is explicit in Surah Al-Kahf that Iblis was from the jinn, and he made the choice to rebel. So the shayateen are simply the jinn who use their free will to actively incite evil and rebellion.
Okay, so what are the other categories?
Well, moving up the scale of power, the classical texts talk about the Marid, which is a particularly obstinate and rebellious entity. And finally, the Ifrit, which denotes a jinn of immense power and cunning.
Right. The Qur'an mentions an Ifrit offering to physically carry the throne of the Queen of Sheba to Prophet Suleiman in the blink of an eye.
Exactly.
So we're talking about serious physical capability in the theology. But, the term that I found most interesting, the one that really blurs the line between theology and human psychology, is the Qur'an.
The constant companion.
Right. The tradition states that every single human being is assigned a Qur'an from the unseen, whose sole job is to suggest bad ideas, to whisper doubt, basically to test the person from the inside out.
Yes, that's the classical understanding.
Now, I was thinking about this deeply before we sat down. If you're a listener trying to reconcile faith with modern psychology, is this Qur'an a literal, external, invisible creature floating over your left shoulder?
A lot of people picture it exactly like that.
Right. Or is it possible that the Qur'an, speaking to a 7th century audience, is giving a metaphysical name to the human subconscious, to our own intrusive thoughts, our cognitive dissonance, our lower ego?
Well, that is not a new question at all. It's actually a debate that has raged between Islamic scholars for centuries.
Really? I thought that was a modern take.
Not entirely. I mean, if you read the classical Orthodox scholars from 1,000 years ago, like Al-Tabari, they viewed this very literally. To them, the unseen world is as concrete as the seen world. It is a literal society of beings, and the Qur'an is a literal independent entity assigned to you.
So concrete biology and physics, just happening outside our visual spectrum.
Exactly. But if you look at modern reformist scholars, like the late philosopher Fazlur Rahman, they lean heavily into the interpretation you just offered.
The psychological one.
Yes. They argue that terms like Jinn, Shaytan, and Qur'an are the Qur'an's phenomenological language for the unseen dimensions of human moral weakness.
Phenomenological language, meaning describing how something feels to experience it rather than what it physically is.
Yes. Because think about it, if you lived 1,000 years ago, you didn't have a vocabulary that included terms like the id or the subconscious or schizophrenia or intrusive thought syndrome.
You just didn't have the words for mental health.
Right. So if a sudden, really dark thought entered your mind that felt entirely alien to your character, how else would you describe it except to say, a hidden entity whispered it to me?
It is a profound way to look at it. But mainstream traditional Sunni Islam does maintain the literal existence of these beings.
Yes, it does.
And if we accept, just for the sake of the discussion, that they are literal independent entities with free will, we immediately crash into a massive problem.
A problem of physics.
Exactly, the fire body problem.
Right.
So the Qur'an states in Surah Ar-Rahman, verse 15, that the jinn are created from murijin min nar, a smokeless fire, or a scorching, piercing fire.
Right.
Now think about this logically. A human being is made of flesh, blood, and water. We are carbon-based. How does a creature made of literal thermodynamic fire interact with us without instantly causing third-degree burns?
It sounds impossible.
Right. If a jinn touches you, why don't your clothes catch on fire?
Well, the classical theologians did not shy away from this at all. They were deeply intellectual, and they saw the physical contradiction right away.
How did they explain it?
Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, who is one of the greatest polymaths of the 12th century, he wrestled with this extensively in his tafsir. He recognized that ordinary fire, like the kind you use to cook food, is destructive.
Yeah, it consumes matter.
Exactly. It cannot constitute a stable, cohesive, living body with organs and an intellect.
So how did he resolve it?
Al-Razi proposed that smokeless fire should not be understood as literal combustion. Instead, he suggested it refers to a subtle, ethereal, luminous energy. In Arabic, a substance that is nurani or highly refined.
So it's not physical flames.
No, it is a different state of matter entirely. It is not the fire that burns wood. It's a fundamental energy that allows them to remain invisible and pass through solid objects.
And this brings up the mechanics of possession, which is arguably the most terrifying aspect of the lore.
Without a doubt.
There is a famous hadith that says the Shaytan flows through the son of Adam like blood. If they are made of this subtle energy, how do they physically enter a human body?
Ibn Taymiyyah, another towering figure in classical Islamic thought, argued the concept of interpenetration.
Interpenetration.
Yes. He said that because jinn possess these subtle, non-dense bodies, they can occupy the exact same physical space as a denser body. Just like heat enters a cold piece of iron, or air fills the empty spaces in a sponge, a jinn can theoretically enter the human form.
I was trying to come up with a modern analogy for this, just to help the listener visualize what Al-Razi and Ibn Taymiyyah were reaching for.
Right, what did you come up with?
Think about Wi-Fi or radio waves.
Okay.
If I took a modern smartphone and traveled back in time to the year 1000 and I tried to explain to a Bedouin that I'm watching a live video of someone on the other side of the planet, I would sound like an absolute lunatic.
They would probably think you were possessed.
Exactly. I would have to tell him, look, there is an invisible force all around us. It is passing right through these thick stone walls. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, but it produces a visible physical effect on this device.
That's a strong visual.
So could the Quranic term smokeless fire just be a 7th century vocabulary word for a non-baryonic electromagnetic reality? Like a frequency we just don't have the biological antennas to tune into?
It's a very clever analogy. And honestly, a lot of contemporary Muslims use that exact framework to reconcile their faith with modern science. The idea of parallel frequencies or dark matter.
It makes sense, right?
It does, but we have to be incredibly careful here. And I actually want to push back on that analogy a little bit.
And why? It seems perfectly logical to me.
Because the moment you say they are made of energy, like Wi-Fi, you are no longer making a theological claim. You are making an empirical scientific claim.
And empirical claims demand empirical evidence.
Exactly. Wi-Fi is invisible to the naked eye, yes, but we can measure it perfectly. We have routers, we have signal meters, we understand exactly how radio frequencies interact with physical matter.
Right, it's measurable.
If a jinn is interacting with the physical world, if it is pushing a glass off the table or altering the neurochemistry in a human brain to cause a hallucination, it must expend energy to do so.
The laws of thermodynamics.
Yes, the laws of thermodynamics dictate that energy transfer leaves a trace.
Conservation of energy. You can't move physical mass without a physical force.
Exactly. So if they are made of immeasurable energy, why has no scientific instrument in history ever registered them?
That's the million-dollar question.
No electromagnetic field sensor, no thermal imaging camera, no radiation detector has ever caught an anomalous spike that could definitively be attributed to a jinn. If they enter a human body and speak through vocal cords, they are manipulating biological tissue.
Which requires force.
Right. But medical science has never found an unexplained force inside a patient.
I see what you mean. The Wi-Fi analogy falls apart because Wi-Fi interacts predictably with our instruments, while the jinn remain permanently outside of measurement.
Precisely.
So this forces a massive question upon the listener. Is possession a literal, ethereal creature sitting inside the cerebral cortex pulling biological levers? Or is it an overwhelming psychological influence, like an internal whispering that a fractured mind just interprets as an external takeover?
And that transition is exactly where the research paper takes us out of the realm of medieval theology and straight into the cold, hard light of the MRI machine.
Because things get very real, very fast.
They do. Because while theologians have spent a millennium debating subtle bodies and smokeless fire, neuroscientists have spent the last few decades scanning the brains of people who swear with every fiber of their being that they are actively being attacked by demons.
Let's look at the most common phenomenon first. We talked about it right at the beginning. Sleep paralysis.
The classic example.
Almost every culture has a name for it. The medieval Europeans called it an incubus or succubus attack.
Mm-hmm.
In Newfoundland, the old sailors called it the old hag riding your chest.
Right.
In Mexico, the phrase literally translates to, a dead body got on top of me.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Islamic world, it is universally attributed to a jinn sitting on your chest to suffocate you. But when you actually put someone in a sleep lab, what does the biology show?
Well, the biology strips away the mystique entirely. The hospital classification for this is a REM parasomnia.
A REM parasomnia.
Yes. And to understand it, you have to understand how sleep works. When you fall asleep, you eventually cycle into REM, sleep rapid eye movement. This is the stage where you have your most vivid, immersive dreams.
And if you're dreaming about running from a tiger, you obviously don't want your physical legs kicking the wall or running out the window?
Exactly. So evolution gave us a safety switch. During REM sleep, the pons, which is a structure in your brainstem, releases neurotransmitters like GABA and glycine. Mm-hmm. These chemicals travel down your spinal cord and literally switch off your motor neurons. They paralyze all your voluntary muscles. It is called muscle atonia. You are placed under a chemical lockdown so you can dream safely.
Okay, so paralysis during sleep is a totally normal nightly function. We all experience it.
Completely normal. But sleep paralysis is what happens when the timing gets botched.
The switch gets stuck.
Basically, yeah. Your conscious mind wakes up, you open your eyes, you are fully aware of your bedroom, but for some reason, maybe stress, sleep deprivation, or even just sleeping on your back, the pons hasn't flipped the switch back yet.
Oh, wow.
So the GABA and glycine are still flooding your spinal cord. Your body is still paralyzed.
That explains why you can't move. But why the feeling of suffocation? Why the feeling of this heavy weight on the chest?
Because your breathing is still being controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which keeps your breaths very shallow during REM sleep. When you wake up panicked because you can't move, your instinct is to take a deep, gasping breath.
But you can't.
No, because your chest muscles are paralyzed. They won't expand. So your brain interprets that inability to take a deep breath as a heavy, crushing weight sitting on top of your chest.
That is terrifying, but it makes perfect biological sense.
Mm.
But what about the shadow figure? The thing standing at the end of the bed or whispering in your ear. Biology explains the paralysis, but it doesn't immediately explain the monster.
Oh, but it actually does.
How?
Think about what is happening in the brain. You are awake, paralyzed, and struggling to breathe. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, starts firing like a car alarm. It is screaming, "We are completely vulnerable. We cannot move. We are going to die."
Okay.
But you are in a quiet, empty bedroom. There is no physical threat.
So the brain has a contradiction. High fear, but no visible threat.
And the brain hates unresolved contradictions. And remember, you are still hovering right on the boundary of REM sleep. So to justify the massive spike of fear in the amygdala, the brain simply opens the dream folder and projects a nightmare directly into your waking visual field.
It hallucinated a predator.
Yes. It paints a shadow figure in the corner of the room to give the fear a logical source. The brain essentially creates the monster to explain its own panic.
Subhanallah. The hardware of the human mind is so complex that it will literally conjure a demon just to make sense of a chemical glitch.
It's incredible, really.
But I want to bring up something crucial from the research here. If the biology is universal, if every human being has a pons, an amygdala, and REM sleep, why do people see such wildly different things?
Ah, yes.
This is where the work of Dr. Balan Jalal comes in, right?
Yes, Dr. Jalal, he's a neuroscientist who conducted a fascinating cross-cultural study on sleep paralysis. He really wanted to know how culture impacts the biology.
So he compared two different groups.
Wildly different groups. He compared people in Denmark and people in Egypt.
Denmark being one of the most highly secular atheist societies on earth, and Egypt being a deeply religious traditional society where belief in Jinn is basically baked into the cultural DNA.
Precisely. And the results were just astounding. In Denmark, when people experience sleep paralysis, they generally report it as a weird physiological glitch.
They just brush it off.
Pretty much. They might see some blurry shapes, but they think, oh, my brain just malfunctioned, and they go back to sleep. They don't attach deep meaning to it. But in Egypt, the experience is radically different and far more severe.
Because they have a cultural script ready to explain it.
Exactly. Egyptians suffer from sleep paralysis 3 times more frequently than the Danes. Their episodes last significantly longer, and the visual hallucinations are far more vivid.
They don't just see a blur.
No, they see specific shadow figures, they hear voices reciting ominous things, and they genuinely believe the experience is physically lethal.
Wait, let me make sure I'm understanding this. The underlying hardware glitch, the muscle atonia, is identical in the Dane and the Egyptian. But the Egyptian's belief in the Jinn actually makes the episode longer and more terrifying.
It is a brutal feedback loop. The cultural priming dictates the hallucination. If you have been told since childhood that invisible fire beings want to harm you in the dark, and you suddenly wake up paralyzed in the dark, your brain immediately loads the Jinn attack software.
It fills in the blanks with what you fear most.
Yes, and that interpretation terrifies you far more than a brain glitch would. That extreme fear makes the amygdala react even stronger. The hyperactive amygdala makes the hallucination more vivid. And the intense neurological stress prolongs the chemical paralysis. The culture literally molds the physical experience.
That is mind-blowing. But what about people who are fully awake? Not hovering between sleep and dreaming, but literally walking down the street in broad daylight, and they clearly hear a voice whispering to them.
Which is a very common symptom in psychiatric cases.
Right. The Qur'an talks about waswasa, the whispering of the Shaytan into the hearts of mankind. A person suffering from schizophrenia will swear to you that there's an external entity speaking into their ear.
And, we must emphasize, they are not lying. They are not making it up for attention. The voices they hear are as loud and as real to them as my voice is to you right now.
But neuroscience has mapped this phenomenon as well, hasn't it?
It has. Functional MRI scans of patients experiencing active auditory hallucinations show something incredible. During the hallucination, a specific region called Broca's area becomes hyperactive.
I remember reading about Broca's area. It is the part of the frontal lobe responsible for language production.
Yes.
It's the engine behind our inner monologue. So if I am reading a book silently or just thinking to myself about what to have for dinner, Broca's area is lighting up.
Right. Every human being has an inner monologue, but normally, when Broca's area generates a thought or a silent sentence, the brain sends out a microscopic neurological signal, a corollary discharge.
A corollary discharge, what does that do?
Think of it like an internal CC email sent to the rest of the brain saying, hey, just a heads up, I generated this thought, it's me. This allows your conscious mind to recognize the inner voice as your own.
So it tags the thought as self.
Exactly. But in a brain suffering from psychosis or severe trauma, that tagging system breaks down. The CC email fails to send.
Oh, wow.
So Broca's area is wildly generating language, but the conscious mind never receives the signal that it is internally generated.
So the conscious mind receives the spoken sentence, doesn't recognize the origin, and logically concludes, well, if I didn't say this, someone else must be speaking to me.
Yes. It misattributes its own internal voice to an external entity. And in a traditional society, the only available vocabulary for an invisible external voice is a jinn.
That is just, it's a staggering biological explanation. But I want to push back on this just to play devil's advocate for the listener who is deeply rooted in the theology.
Please do.
Let's say I accept your MRI scans, the chemical glitch, the amygdala, Broca's area failing to tag the thought. Does mapping the physical mechanism definitively prove that the unseen entity isn't there?
That's the classic counterargument.
Right, I was trying to come up with an analogy for this. Let's say we are sitting in this courtyard and a guy walks up and punches me in the arm.
Okay.
My brain registers pain. The nociceptors in my skin fire off electrical signals up my spinal cord. My brain releases certain chemicals to process the trauma. You could put me in an MRI machine and perfectly map the exact neurological mechanism of my pain.
Down to the last synapse.
Exactly. The chemicals are real. The electrical signals are real. But so's the guy who punched me. Could a jinn simply be the guy throwing the punch? Could it be interacting with the brain's neurochemistry, pushing the dopamine levers, or triggering Broca's area?
I love that you brought that up, because it is the most sophisticated defense used by traditionalist scholars and even some spiritually inclined psychiatrists.
So that's a valid point.
They argue that science only maps the terrain, not the cause. If a jinn is subtle, maybe it uses the physical hardware of the brain to manifest its influence. It's a logically coherent theological argument, because science cannot disprove an invisible, unmeasurable cause.
But I hear a but coming.
But from a strict scientific standpoint, it violates Occam's razor.
Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one.
Right. If a patient is deeply traumatized and their brain chemistry is visibly altered, and giving them an antipsychotic medication that dials down their dopamine immediately makes the jinn disappear, do we really need to add an invisible, fire-based entity to the equation to explain what happened? Science says no. The trauma and the neurochemistry are entirely sufficient to explain the symptoms. Theology might say yes, the jinn exploited the biological vulnerability.
So it comes down to a choice of framework.
Essentially, the research paper we are discussing doesn't force the reader to choose one over the other, but it absolutely demands that you acknowledge the medical reality is sufficient on its own.
Fair enough. Let's step away from the human brain then, because there's another angle. Let's look at things that don't have a Broca's area, don't experience trauma, and definitely don't believe in jinn. Yes, cameras. The internet is absolutely flooded with CCTV footage, smartphone videos, and Ring doorbell clips of paranormal activity.
Millions of them.
Shadow figures walking through walls, objects moving, strange mists. If it's all just internal brain chemistry, how are these entities being caught on camera?
The paper dedicates a very rigorous section to digital forensics, and it is absolutely merciless in debunking this.
Merciless. How so?
The problem is that most people think a digital camera works like a human eye. It doesn't. We have to understand how a camera actually processes visual data, particularly in the middle of the night, which is when 99% of these videos are recorded.
So take the classic CCTV shadow figure. You see a blurry, dark, cloaked shape drifting across an empty parking lot.
It's always a grainy black and white video, isn't it?
Always.
And that grain is the first clue. Security cameras operate in low light. To gather enough light to see anything at all, the camera's sensor has to boost its sensitivity, which is known as ISO.
Okay, ISO.
But boosting sensitivity introduces electronic interference, which manifests as digital noise or grain. Now, on top of that, security systems have to store days or weeks of footage.
Right, they can't just run out of hard drive space.
Exactly. So to save space, they use aggressive video compression algorithms, usually H.264 or HEVC.
How does that compression work? I assume it doesn't record a perfect photograph 30 times a second.
Not at all. That would require terabytes of data a day. Instead, the algorithm uses a trick. It records one complete image called an iframe or keyframe, but for the next few dozen frames, it only records the pixels that change.
Oh, really?
Yes. It is basically guessing the movement. It's called motion interpolation. Think of it like a painter who paints a background once and then only repaints the car moving across the street, leaving the background untouched to save paint.
That makes a lot of sense for saving data.
But put that algorithm in a dark parking lot. The image is full of noisy, shifting grain. The compression algorithm is desperately trying to smooth out the noise while also predicting movement.
So it's confused.
Highly confused. If a moth flies close to the lens out of focus, or a plastic bag blows by in the background, or even if the ambient light suddenly shifts, the algorithm tries to predict where the pixels should go, fails, and ends up smearing them together.
It creates a ghost.
It creates a trailing, distorted, ghost-like artifact on the screen.
And then the human being watches the tape the next morning.
And this is where the camera glitch meets human psychology. We talked about pareidolia earlier. Our brains have highly specialized facial recognition software. We are evolutionarily hardwired to spot predators and humans in the bushes.
So when we look at a compression artifact,
A blurry smear of pixels on a screen, our brain instantly forces it into a familiar shape. It screams, "That's a person wearing a cloak." The camera created a mathematical error. Our brain created the ghost.
wow. The notes also mention something called the rolling shutter effect.
Yes. Most digital cameras, especially on cheap smartphones, do not capture the entire image at the exact same microsecond. They scan the image onto the sensor line by line, usually from top to bottom, incredibly fast.
Like a scanner bed.
Exactly. But if an object moves rapidly across the frame while the sensor is still scanning, like an insect flying past the lens or the blades of a ceiling fan, the object gets recorded at different positions as the scan moves down.
So it warps the image.
It completely distorts it. A bug flapping its wings fast enough will look like a bizarre, twisting, supernatural rod of light. People upload these videos claiming they've caught a Jinn flying through the room. It looks supernatural, but it is just a mechanical limitation of the sensor.
Reading through this section, there were some very pointed questions from atheists and skeptics that the paper includes. They ask, if Jinn are real physical entities interacting with our physical world, why do they never leave a trace that stands up to scientific scrutiny?
Why no DNA, right?
Exactly. Why no thermal footprint on a FLIR camera?
And the most devastating skeptical question, why do Jinn supposedly flee from a piece of iron or a line of salt, but they never seem to flee from a laboratory environment equipped with scientific measuring instruments?
Right. If you set up a controlled environment with sensitive equipment to measure electromagnetic fields or physical disturbances, nothing happens. It is always dead quiet.
Always.
The activity only ever happens on a cheap 720p security camera in a dusty basement or on a shaky smartphone in the dark.
The skeptical argument here is very strong. They point out that Jinn sightings have simply evolved alongside our technology. 200 years ago, people saw them in the flickering, ambiguous light of oil lamps.
And today?
Today, we see them in the digital noise of compressed video and rolling shutters. The medium changes, but the ambiguity is constant. The skeptic asks, if they were objectively real, then as our camera resolution went from 480p to 4K to 8K, our evidence of them should have gotten sharper and clearer.
But it hasn't.
It hasn't at all. The evidence always retreats, continuing to live only in the blurry margins of whatever technology we happen to be using at the time.
That is a very tough pill to swallow for someone heavily invested in the paranormal. But the paper doesn't just debunk the videos, it looks at this globally. And this brings up an incredible point about comparative religion.
Because this is not just a Muslim phenomenon.
Exactly. Every culture on the planet experiences these exact same things.
The phenomenological similarities are staggering, and they really force us to look at human nature. If you go to a rural village in Upper Egypt, you will find people describing classical jinn possession.
What does that look like specifically?
The afflicted person speaks in an altered, guttural voice. They show extreme aversion to the recitation of the Qur'an. They contort their bodies in unnatural ways, and they possess strange physical strength.
Okay, keep that image in your mind. Now, what happens if you travel thousands of miles away to a rural town in Mexico.
You will find a devout Catholic exhibiting the exact same physical symptoms. They will speak in an altered voice. They will show violent aversion to holy water or a crucifix. They will thrash around, and they will claim to be possessed by demons or fallen angels.
And if you go to a village in India,
A Hindu will exhibit the exact same symptoms, claiming possession by a Bhuta or a Preta or perhaps a minor deity, and they will show aversion to specific mantras and be cured by offerings.
it's identical.
In Judaism, there are historical accounts of the Dibbuk, a disembodied soul causing identical erratic behavior. In African traditional religions, the exact same symptoms are attributed to angry ancestor spirits.
I want the listener to really sit with this question for a moment. If an Egyptian Muslim, a Mexican Catholic, and a rural Hindu all exhibit the exact same possession symptoms, they all alter their voices, they all thrash on the floor, they all show aversion to their respective holy symbols.
And most importantly, they are all eventually cured by their own specific religious ritual.
Yes. What does that tell us? Does it mean that the jinn exist everywhere, and they just adapt to local cultures, wearing the mask of a Catholic demon in Mexico and a Hindu ghost in India? Or does it mean that the human brain have a universal distress program?
That is the crux of the anthropological argument. The evidence strongly suggests that the human brain has a universal capacity to dissociate and fragment under extreme psychological stress.
So the hardware glitch is universal.
But the hardware glitch is the same everywhere. It is a human defense mechanism against overwhelming trauma or mental illness. But the software, the interpretation of the glitch, is provided entirely by the local culture.
So the Muslim patient uses the software of the jinn.
Exactly. The Catholic patient uses the software of demons.
The internal distress is universal, but the vocabulary used to express it is strictly local.
Yes. And the fact that the Muslim is cured by ruqyah, the Catholic is cured by a Catholic exorcism, and the Hindu is cured by a local shaman suggests something profound about the healing mechanism.
Wait.
It suggests that the cure isn't necessarily the literal physical expulsion of an entity. It suggests that the ritual itself is what heals. The undivided attention of the community, the supreme authority of the religious figure, the physical catharsis of the screaming and the crying, it all provides a massive psychological reset for the person suffering.
Which brings us out of the theoretical and into the deeply practical. Because discussing neuroscience, comparative religion, and camera algorithms is intellectually stimulating, but right now, somewhere in the world, a family is sitting in their living room, utterly terrified.
Living in nightmare.
A loved one is screaming, not sleeping, neglecting their hygiene, and acting completely out of character. And that family has to make a real-world, life-altering choice. Do they call a sheikh for ruqyah, or they call a hospital for a psychiatric evaluation?
It is the most critical decision they will make. And unfortunately, in many traditional communities, it is presented as a strict, mutually exclusive binary, a false dichotomy.
It is framed as jinn versus psychiatry. Why is there such a deep divide? Why do people feel they have to choose one or the other?
Well, it comes down to a fundamental lack of trust and a clash of worldviews. Many traditionalists view modern psychiatry as a secular, materialist framework that inherently denies the reality of God and the unseen.
So they see it as a threat to their faith.
Right. They feel that taking a deeply disturbed family member to a medical doctor is a betrayal of faith. They fear the psychiatrist will just drug the patient into a stupor.
And what about the medical side?
On the flip side, secular psychiatrists often lack cultural competence. They dismiss the patient's deeply held religious framework entirely, treating their belief in jinn as just another part of the delusion. This alienates the patient and deeply offends the family.
But we have to acknowledge a reality that the research paper highlights. Ruqyah, the recitation of the Qur'an, over the sick person, actually works for some people.
It undeniably does.
There are documented cases where people have been in traditional Western talk therapy for years with zero progress, and they recover rapidly after a few intensive ruqyah sessions. If there is no physical demon being burned away, how does science explain that sudden cure?
Science explains it through several incredibly powerful, overlapping psychological and physiological mechanisms. First, there is the power of ritual anxiety reduction.
Ritual anxiety reduction.
Yes. Mental illness often involves intense internal chaos, a complete loss of control. A structured religious ritual provides profound meaning. It takes the chaos and places it into a familiar narrative. It provides a clear, culturally understood path to resolution.
Oh, what about the physiological impact of the recitation itself?
Oh, it is massive. The soothing prosody of classical Arabic recitation, The rhythmic chanting directly engages the vagus nerve, which stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system.
So it's physically calming them down.
Physically, it lowers the patient's heart rate, reduces cortisol levels, and calms erratic breathing. Furthermore, consider the placebo effect.
Right, the power of belief.
The placebo effect isn't just in your head. It creates real, measurable changes in brain chemistry. If a patient deeply, truly believes that the recitation of the Word of God will cure them, their brain initiates a cascade of healing neurochemicals.
To mention the social aspect, you suddenly have your entire family and a respected community elder dedicating all their time and energy to your well-being.
Yes, that alone is deeply therapeutic for someone suffering from neglect or isolation. All of these factors combined can lead to a sudden, dramatic reduction in symptoms, particularly if the underlying issue is a psychosomatic disorder, hysteria, or severe stress.
But relying exclusively on ruqyah brings a profound, sometimes fatal danger: the tragedy of misdiagnosis.
It is a heartbreaking reality. The paper cites numerous clinical case studies where people suffering from severe, untreated organic diseases like temporal lobe epilepsy, brain tumors, or acute schizophrenia were subjected to aggressive, prolonged exorcism rituals.
Because the family is convinced that the medical symptoms are the jinn fighting back.
Exactly. If an epileptic patient seizes during the recitation, the traditional healer might interpret the seizure as the jinn resisting the Qur'an. This leads to escalating physical interventions.
It gets dangerous.
Very dangerous. Patients are sometimes physically restrained, beaten, or starved in an attempt to punish the jinn inside them. The family isn't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believe they are fighting a spiritual war for their loved one's soul. But what the patient actually needs is an anticonvulsant medication to stop the electrical storm in their brain.
Or in the case of schizophrenia, they need a dopamine antagonist. I was reading about how antipsychotic medications actually work. Schizophrenia is often linked to an overactive dopamine system in the brain's salience network.
That's right.
Dopamine doesn't just make you feel good, it tags things in your environment as important or meaningful. If the dopamine system misfires, your brain starts attaching profound, terrifying meaning to random things: a shadow, a creak in the floorboards.
Yes. And when you give that patient a dopamine antagonist, the medication physically blocks the dopamine receptors. It turns the brain's meaning volume knob back down to a normal level.
And the symptoms just fade.
The hallucinations stop, the voices fade, the paranoia dissolves, the jinn disappears. That is a replicable clinical fact.
Which brings up a devastating question for the strict literalist. If the entity possessing the person is purely a metaphysical being made of smokeless fire, an entity with its own free will and consciousness, why would it be defeated by a pill that merely adjusts human dopamine receptors?
Exactly. Why does the fire being care about a chemical compound?
It doesn't make sense.
And that is the precise question that traditionalists struggle to answer scientifically. And this is exactly why the most forward-thinking medical and Islamic scholars today are advocating intensely for integrated care models.
What does an integrated care model look like in practice? Let's say I bring a family member to one of these progressive clinics.
It looks like differential diagnostic literacy. It means that the absolute first step must always be ruling out organic and psychiatric causes. The clinician will run blood tests, do an EEG to check for epilepsy, scan for tumors, and evaluate for trauma or sleep disorders.
You treat the biology with modern medicine first.
Always.
And the spiritual side. Is it just discarded?
Absolutely not. It operates in tandem. In places like Denmark, where they have piloted these programs for Muslim immigrants, and in emerging clinics in Muslim-majority countries, they use a dual-track approach.
A dual-track approach, I like that.
The patient receives their antipsychotic medication, but they are also encouraged to seek ruqyah for spiritual comfort, for connection to Allah, and for the psychological benefits of the ritual. The imam and the psychiatrist work together, not as rivals.
And the results?
The outcomes are significantly better because the patient is not forced to choose between their medicine and their faith. They don't feel spiritually abandoned by the doctor, and they don't feel medically neglected by the sheikh.
I was reflecting on something as I read the final pages of the research. We have talked a lot about extreme cases, schizophrenia, intense sleep paralysis. But what about everyday life?
What do you mean?
Sometimes attributing our mental illness, our deep depression, or even our failing marriages to a jinn or the evil eye. It acts as a very convenient coping mechanism.
In what sense?
In the sense that it completely removes personal accountability. It is so much easier for me to say, a jinn made me lose my temper, or my mother-in-law gave my marriage the evil eye, than it is to sit down and admit the painful truth.
The truth about ourselves.
Yes, to admit, I have a chemical imbalance in my brain that I need medication for, or
Mhm.
I have deep, unresolved anger issues from my childhood that I am projecting onto my spouse, and I need to do the hard, humiliating work of going to therapy. Blaming the unseen externalizes the problem.
It makes someone else's fault.
It makes me the victim of a magical attack, rather than the author of my own dysfunction.
That is a deeply uncomfortable truth for many communities to face. Anthropologists and sociologists call this an idiom of distress.
An idiom of distress.
Yes. It is a culturally acceptable way to express pain or failure without taking on the crushing stigma of mental illness. In many traditional shame-based societies, having a psychiatric disorder is a social death sentence. It ruins your marriage prospects. It isolates your entire family. It brings shame upon your parents.
But being the victim of a Jinn attack.
Being the victim of a Jinn attack preserves your honor. It transforms you from someone who is mentally broken into someone who is a casualty of external spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
It is a socially protective belief system. It allows the person to receive sympathy and care from the community without the stigma of being labeled crazy.
So the belief system actually protects them socially, even while it might delay or prevent their medical treatment. That is a profound paradox.
Yes. And that is exactly why clinicians, social workers, and even religious leaders have to be incredibly gentle and culturally competent. You cannot just aggressively strip away someone's cultural framework, their idiom of distress, without offering them a safe, stigma-free alternative. You have to work within their worldview to deliver the care they so desperately need.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have traveled from the desolate, windswept deserts of 7th century poetry to the high-tech hum of modern MRI machines, through the digital algorithms of camera compression, and into the heartbreaking realities of psychiatric care.
It's a vast topic.
But if there is one thing I keep coming back to as we sit here in the quiet, it is the root of the word itself. Jinn, the hidden.
The concealed, the veiled.
Right. And perhaps our modern obsession with trying to catch them on blurry, grainy CCTV cameras, or our tendency to blame them for every psychological struggle and personal failure we face,
Yeah.
perhaps that obsession is missing the entire point of the Quranic narrative.
I completely agree.
The unseen is meant to be exactly that, unseen. It is meant to be a test of faith, a humbling reminder that our physical senses are severely limited, and that the universe is far larger and more complex than what we can measure in a laboratory. It was never meant to be an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for our own mental, emotional, and spiritual health.
That is a beautiful way to synthesize it. They remind us of the limits of our perception, but they do not absolve us of our duties in the visible world. We are still responsible for seeking knowledge, for pursuing medical healing, for maintaining our relationships, and ultimately for confronting the hidden shadows within ourselves.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel at Missing Dots. Thank you.